Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moffin coming at you with another APUS history video focusing in on topic 4.11, an age of reform. This is our third video on this topic. And today's part of the topic is going to be focusing in on probably the most significant of the reform movements of this time. And yes, the drive for women's suffrage and the drive for temperance and the drive for reforming education education is going to be all very important stuff, but the movement to try to get rid of slavery in this country in the antebellum era is going to be very, very significant. And of course, we call this move to try to get rid of slavery in America the abolitionist movement, to abolish slavery. Now, for many, we think of the abolitionist movement as a very simplistic kind of a thing, with a very simplistic goal of just getting rid of slavery. Well, it's actually more complex than that, because when we're talking about abolition, especially in this early part of the 19th century, there's a question of, should emancipation be happening gradually? In other words, should you start to, try to fight for policies in Congress that will, kind of ban future individuals from being slaves, but maintaining the current individuals that are enslaved to stay slaves? And even if you do promote emancipation, what do you do with those that have become emancipated if that does happen? So there becomes some very, important concerns about this. If you do also, for example, abolish slavery, what do you do in terms of compensation for slave owners? The thought was back then that slaves were property, and if you immediately, take away somebody's property, is that person entitled to compensation? So there are a number of complex questions that are going to be part of this question, or they're going to be part of this issue, rather. So that being said, one other thing to kind of keep in mind is that, when we talk about abolition, there's also this, general assumption that abolitionists, since they were opposed to slavery, and let's be honest, the abolitionist movement is certainly going to be influenced by things like the Transcendentalist movement, for example, and other things. But there's a general assumption that abolitionists were also opposed to racism and discrimination. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case. In fact, most abolitionists were, by today's standards, racist. They did not view black Americans as worthy of being the social and political equals of whites. They just believed that slavery as an institution was evil and dehumanizing and could not be tolerated. And note also, let's be honest, many of these abolitionists were opposed to slavery for purely economic reasons. The idea being that slavery as an institution drives down wages for employees. So you had a lot of poor working class whites that were opposed to abolition, opposed to slavery in favor of abolition, not so much out of a sense of concern for black Americans, but more of a personal concern for being able to have higher wages. So keep in mind, this is a very, very complex situation. Now, one of the thoughts about what to do with slaves when and if they become emancipated is the goal of the American Colonization Society. And the idea being was to take emancipated slaves and have them be, in essence, exported to Africa. Now, once again, this is an example of the idea of being opposed to slavery, but not in favor of racial integration. And this is going to, culminate in the creation of what's going to be called Liberia as a new independent nation in West Africa. Liberia will be founded in the 1820s, and in fact, the capital of Liberia is Monrovia. And yes, that sounds like something you've heard before. Yes, it is named after President James Monroe, who was president at that time. Liberia is one of the oldest independent nations in the history of Africa. And yes, there were thousands of slaves that had become emancipated by that point, that were that did migrate to Liberia. But note, it's really out of a sense of white Americans not wanting to live and work amongst black Americans to promote this idea. And it also, let's be honest, it also shows a lot of ignorance by, white Americans at this time. The idea being, okay, if somebody's black, we can send that person to Africa and they'll just automatically fit right in with other black people, and there won't be any issues at all. And that's very ignorant of the reality that if you are black, by this point in time, almost certainly you were born in the United States. Your parents were probably born in the United States, and probably your grandparents were probably born in the United States. So you really didn't have this direct connection to Africa, and so it was very, very arrogant and ignorant to just assume that, okay, we're just going to take someone that's black, send them to Africa, and everything will just be fine. So obviously a lot of this stuff is problematic for sure. Like other reform movements, abolitionism is going to be infused in many aspects of American culture, including education. Don't forget that reforms in education were not just simply teaching people the basic literacy skills of reading and writing and arithmetic, but also infusing values. It might be the Protestant work ethic, or as you can see here, promoting the idea of abolition and ending slavery. Now, as we get into more of the 1830s and 1840s, the abolitionist movement is continuing to slowly pick up more and more steam. And as the abolitionism movement goes through the early 19th century, it's not only picking up more support, it's also becoming more radical in terms of its goals and demands. And a lot of this is going to be led by abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, pictured here. And as far as Garrison was concerned, the abolition issue was very simple. Slavery is evil, it must be destroyed, and no compensation is to be given to anybody that owns slaves, because according to people like Garrison, if you're owning other human beings, you're involved in an evil, immoral institution, and you should not be financially rewarded for engaging in that. So it's a very absolutist kind of sense on abolition at a time where that was not necessarily the case. But it does start to kind of mobilize what it kind of starts the evolutionary process of what abolitionism will become by the time we do get to the dawn of the Civil War. And understand that, this also sends a message to those that maybe own slaves that abolitionism was not just an idea of a difference of opinion on the issue of slavery, but as the abolitionist movement becomes more, radical, as Southern slave owners would describe it, it's seen as an existential threat to the South in and of itself, and a sense that abolitionists really did not care about the long-term fate of the South, given the fact that the South's economy and almost entire way of life is tied to the perpetuation of this institution called slavery. Now, to promote the abolitionist goals, we will see Garrison publish a magazine known as The Liberator. And, this is going to start to, once again, galvanize this abolitionist movement in more of a kind of a radical way. It's starting to unite folks across the North. And once again, as these more kind of radical abolitionist sentiment starts to galvanize more in the North collectively, it's also going to galvanize backlash in the South. So this stuff kind of adds to this growing sectionalism that's emerging between the North and the South. And of course, abolitionists are going to be, very, very quick to point out the immorality of slavery. That it's not just a difference of opinion on economics, that slavery is, by definition, wholly immoral and evil. As you can kind of see in this cartoon here, the idea that slavery is, the base of all of these horrible activities that human beings will engage in, brutality and rape and, death and, all this kind of horrible stuff is all springing from slavery in many cases. And, out of a desire for greed and out of a desire of, racism, that slave owners are going to be engaging in some of the worst attributes that humans can engage in. So keep in mind that as the abolitionist movement continues, it's not just a social movement. It also takes on tremendous political messaging. And this will lead to the creation of independent third parties that are going to be primarily focused on the slavery issue and in favor of abolition. For example, we will see the creation of the Liberty Party in the 1840s. Liberty meaning ending slavery. When we get into the 1850s, we're going to see, the Free Soil Party be emerging. So we're starting to see, political activism to galvanize seemingly on one issue, and that one issue being slavery. And this is especially important at a time where the major parties were too scared to take a firm stance on the slavery issue, so as to, perhaps alienate a base of support. So these independent third parties are important and courageous at a time where the major parties were not so much. Now, when we do talk about other abolitionists of color, the most famous is going to be Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass will be a colleague of Garrison with the Liberator for a number of years, but eventually we'll have some differences of opinion on some matters, and he will go out on his own and publish the North Star. And unlike his white counterparts in abolition, Douglass can speak to slavery from a personal background because Douglass was a runaway slave. And Douglass is going to be chronicling his experiences as a slave in the famous Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. We'll be taking a look at some excerpts of that in class, and it gives you a much more eye-opening, much more visceral, and in many respects blood-curdling account of the realities of slavery for a slave. We've already mentioned Sojourner Truth previously, of course, a very important feminist and fighter for abolition. But we also should make mention of the work of Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman is going to be a courageous woman that is going to help promote the existence of what's going to be called the Underground Railroad. The idea being is that you will set up a network of safe houses across the South to help kind of shuttle runaway slaves away from the South, the enslaved South, and into the free states north of the Ohio River, or even ultimately into Canada. And if you're kind of thinking like, well, how does this work? What do you mean safe houses? Well, you got to remember, even though the vast majority of white folks supported slavery, there were exceptions. And, through this extensive network of communication at a time where communication is a little bit limited, it is pretty remarkable that we're going to be able to see safe houses set up and, hiding places in attics or in cellars or in wagons or whatever to be able to help escort these runaway slaves towards freedom. And as the Underground Railroad takes on more and more importance and is able for lifting more and more black Americans that have been enslaved into freedom and into emancipation, it's going to be seen as really, really, really dangerous to the institution of slavery by Southerners, south of the Ohio River. And as you can kind of see here, and as we'll talk more about the institution of slavery, slavery is primarily found in the United States in the deep southern states. So if you're talking about organizing these networks along the Underground Railroad, you're talking about an extensive network, a lot of miles to travel typically to get north of the Ohio River, and in some cases, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, getting north into Canada. Okay, so with that being said, we're going to leave it there, talking about abolitionism as probably the most significant of these reform movements. We'll see you next time.